My name is Valentina Cruz. I am 31 years old, and I used to believe that a woman who kept her head down, worked twice as hard as anyone expected, and loved her husband without condition was a woman who had earned her safety. I was wrong. I grew up in a house where my father believed that the only things worth building were things meant to last. He said that once when I was 9, standing in the kitchen doorway watching him review contracts at the dining table while my mother set out food he'd barely touch. He didn't look up when he said it. He was the kind of man who didn't need an audience to mean what he said. Alejandro Cruz had built Meridian Capital Partners from a single regional office in Phoenix into a private equity group managing close to $2 billion in assets across 11 states. He had done this quietly, without press releases, without a profile in any magazine. He had done it the way he did everything, methodically, without sentiment, and with a precision that people who underestimated him always regretted. I was his only child. I didn't grow up inside the company exactly, but I grew up beside it. Summer afternoons in his conference room doing homework at the end of the table while he ran calls. Sitting in the back seat on drives to meet clients, listening to him explain deal structures in plain language because he said I should understand how money actually moved before I was old enough to make any. By the time I was in college, studying finance at the University of Arizona on my own insistence, not because he pushed me but because I was genuinely drawn to it, I had already absorbed more about capital structure and partnership agreements than most analysts learn in their first 2 years. I graduated in 3.5 years. I didn't announce this to anyone. After graduation, my father offered me a junior analyst seat at Meridian. I turned it down. I didn't want anything handed to me. I wanted to earn my footing somewhere I wasn't the founder's daughter, somewhere the floor I stood on was mine. I spent 4 years at a mid-size acquisitions firm in Scottsdale, starting as a research analyst and finishing as a senior associate with my name on 3 closed deals totaling just over $400 million. I was 26 when I left. I was proud of that record in the quiet way my father had taught me to be proud of things, privately, without performance. Before I left that firm, I had already started a habit I would carry forward without quite naming it. I kept copies of everything I built. Models, letters, performance summaries, my own record of my own work, separate from any firm's server. It was instinct more than strategy. I had a fee reconciliation analysis I'd drafted there that ran 40 pages and saved the firm a disputed recovery no one else had wanted to untangle. I kept that document too. I didn't know then that I would need it. I kept it anyway. That was the same year I met Garrett Ellison. He came into my professional orbit during a conference in Denver, a panel on regional private equity growth, the kind of event that draws mid-market players who are hungry but not yet loud about it. Garrett ran a firm called Ellison Meridian Group, which, I would later understand, had borrowed its name from my father's company in a way that was either admiring or opportunistic depending on how you chose to read it. He was 38 then, polished in the way men who have spent a decade building something tend to be, confident without being aggressive, attentive in a way that registered as genuine. He asked smart questions after the panel. He remembered what I said. He called me 2 days later. We dated for 14 months. He was good to me in that period, or he performed goodness convincingly enough that I did not yet know the difference. He met my father once before the engagement, a dinner at my parents' house in Scottsdale that lasted 3 hours. My father was warm but measured in the way he always was with people he was still assessing. Garrett talked a great deal about his firm's trajectory, about deals in the pipeline, about his vision for the next 5 years. My father listened more than he spoke. On the drive home after, my father said only, "He's ambitious." There was a pause. "Make sure you know what he's ambitious for." I told myself I did know. I told myself I had been careful. I wasn't. We were married in April, 18 months after we met, in a small ceremony in Sedona at a venue with Red Rock views and 60 guests. My mother cried. My father shook Garrett's hand and looked him in the eye for a long moment and said nothing. I took Garrett's last name professionally for 2 years before quietly reverting to Cruz on my own accounts, which Garrett never noticed and didn't ask about. By the spring of this year, 3 years into our marriage, I was working inside Garrett's firm, Ellison Meridian Group, as Director of Portfolio Strategy. I had taken the role 18 months earlier at Garrett's request, after his previous director left abruptly because he said he needed someone he trusted, someone who understood the assets the way I did. I had rebuilt the portfolio tracking system from scratch. I had renegotiated 2 underperforming fund agreements and recovered a combined $1.4 million in deferred management fees that the previous director had left on the table. I had done this without fanfare, without a title bump, without a salary adjustment, because Garrett said the firm was in a consolidation phase and raises would come in the next cycle. The next cycle kept moving. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed in something longer than you should have because you kept believing the version of it that existed at the beginning, I think you'll understand what comes next. Because what happened at the Gala was not something that came out of nowhere. It came out of 3 years of small erasures I had convinced myself were compromises. I want you to hold that thought as I take you back to where it started. The first time Garrett humiliated me in front of people who mattered, it was 6 months into my time at the firm, at a dinner with 2 of our limited partners, the Halverson Group out of Denver and a family office representative named Peter Crane who oversaw a $30 million commitment we could not afford to lose. We met at a steakhouse in downtown Scottsdale, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and leather booths and a wine list that came in a leather binder. I had prepared for the dinner the way. I prepared for everything thoroughly. I had pulled the latest quarterly performance summaries on both the Halverson Group's 2 positions with us and the family office's single holding, annotated the yield variance from the prior quarter, and drafted 3 talking points for Garrett in case the conversation turned toward rebalancing expectations. I sent him the summary document that afternoon. He read-receipted it and said nothing back. At dinner, we were 40 minutes in when Peter Crane turned the conversation toward the Q3 numbers. He had concerns, specific ones, the kind that signaled he had done his own analysis and was testing whether we had done ours. Garrett nodded slowly, the way he did when he was buying time, and then he said something vague about market headwinds and portfolio recalibration that didn't actually address what Peter had asked. I said, the yield variance in Q3 came from a 3-week lag in the secondary position rebalancing. We've since corrected the timeline, and the Q4 projections show a return to the original yield band. I said it evenly with the numbers behind it because I had the numbers. Peter nodded. He seemed satisfied. Garrett laughed. It was a short sound, barely 2 beats, the kind of laugh that is designed to land softly on everyone else in the room except the person it's aimed at. He reached over and put his hand briefly on my forearm, a performance of affection that was actually a form of correction, and said, Valentina has a gift for making the technical side sound simple. You'll have to forgive her, she forgets we're not all in the same spreadsheet she is. Peter smiled politely. The Halverson representative smiled. I did not. I squared the papers in front of me and said nothing. What Garrett had done was not correct me. He had not actually disputed what I said because what I said was accurate and he knew it. What he had done was smaller and more deliberate than that. He had reframed my competence as a kind of charming excess, a wifely enthusiasm for numbers, something that needed to be managed in front of clients the way you manage a bright child who speaks out of turn. He had taken the correct answer I had given and made it into evidence that I didn't understand the room. I understood the room better than he did. I had read Peter Crane's concern correctly when Garrett had not. But understanding that in the moment and naming it in the moment were 2 different things, and I had not yet learned which one to choose. After the clients left, in the car on the way home, I told Garrett that what he had said undermined me. I said it calmly, without accusation in my voice, because I had learned early that accusation gave him something to deflect toward. He didn't deflect. He did something I hadn't expected. He looked at the road and said, Peter Crane is 62 years old, and he comes from a generation that doesn't respond well to being corrected by someone who's been in the industry for 4 years. I was managing the dynamic. I've been in the industry for 8 years, I said. At this firm for 8 months, he said. There's a difference. I looked out the passenger window at the dark stretch of desert highway and felt something settle in my chest, not hurt exactly and not anger. Something quieter than both. A recognition that I was going to have to decide what kind of woman I was going to be inside this marriage, and whether those 2 things, the marriage and the woman, were going to fit together the way I had believed they would. I didn't answer him. I pressed my thumbnail against the edge of my seatbelt buckle slowly once and watched the lights on the highway go past. The pattern that started that night did not get better. It found new forms. At a firm retreat in Sedona 4 months later, Garrett introduced me to a group of associates as my wife, who also works with us. Not as director of portfolio strategy, not by title at all, just as the wife who happened to be in the building. I corrected the introduction myself, directly and without apology, and watched Garrett's jaw tighten slightly in a way only I could read. On the drive back he told me I had made it awkward. I told him his introduction had made it inaccurate. There were smaller ones. At client lunches where he'd summarize work I had done as work the team had done. In emails where my analysis would appear in a firm update without attribution. In meetings where he would restate a point I had made 3 minutes earlier as though he'd arrived at it independently, and no one in the room would blink because no one in the room had been tracking who said what first. I tracked it. I always tracked it. The version of Garrett I had married, or the version I had constructed from what I observed and what I wanted to observe, had been replaced so gradually that I couldn't name a single moment when the replacement was complete. That is the particular cruelty of incremental erosion. There is no hinge. There is only the slow accumulation of evidence you keep filing under complicated because over is a word you are not yet ready to use. Let me tell you what I actually built during those 3 years. In the first year of my time at the firm, before I had a formal title and was working on what Garrett called a consulting basis, I rebuilt the fund performance reporting system. The previous system was a patchwork of spreadsheets maintained by 3 different analysts who had each inherited it from someone before them, and none of whom understood the full architecture. It generated errors in the quarterly LP reports that had been caught twice by outside auditors, the kind of errors that don't lose you money immediately but erode institutional confidence over time. I mapped the full data flow, identified 6 redundant input fields that were creating inconsistencies, and rebuilt the master reporting template in 6 weeks. I ran it parallel to the old system for a full quarter to validate accuracy before we switched. I did this while managing my own deal monitoring workload. The new system has been in use for 2 years. I built it in 12 weeks total, in evenings and on weekends, without a single line item in the budget for my time. In the second year, I was formally titled Director of Portfolio Strategy and assigned to lead a renegotiation with a fund administrator who had been slow-rolling fee reconciliations for over a year. 2 previous attempts to resolve it through the firm's external counsel had stalled. I pulled the original fund administration agreement, cross-referenced it against 17 months of quarterly statements, identified 3 specific clauses the administrator was misapplying, and drafted a 12-page remediation letter that our counsel reviewed and called the cleanest documentation we've seen on a fee dispute this size. The administrator settled within 45 days. The recovery was $940,000 against a legal cost of just under $80,000. I have never seen my name in any of the firm's investor communications referencing that outcome. Also in year 2, I identified a mid-market commercial real estate holding in the portfolio that was underperforming against its original acquisition thesis due to a shift in the anchor tenant's lease terms. The previous director had flagged it as a monitoring situation. I modeled 4 exit scenarios, stress-tested 2 of them against 3 different market conditions, and recommended a structured secondary sale 18 months ahead of the original hold period. Garrett resisted initially. He had negotiated the original acquisition, and I think the recommendation felt like a judgment on his judgment. I waited 3 months, watched the numbers worsen by the margin I had projected, and brought the model back to him. He approved the sale. We exited at a 6.2% premium to the revised NAV. In the next LP update, the exit was described as a strategic portfolio optimization decision by firm leadership. Year 3 was quieter on the deal side and louder on everything else. I remember a Tuesday in March, 8 months before the gala. Garrett and I were in the kitchen. Our kitchen, in the house I had helped furnish and organize and maintain alongside everything I was doing at the firm, and I was reviewing a partnership amendment on my laptop while he read something on his phone. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, set it face down on the counter, and said to me without looking up, "You should probably think about whether you actually want to keep doing the director role." I looked up from my screen. "What does that mean?" "It means the optics are getting complicated," he said. "Having your wife in a senior role. Some of the LPs have mentioned it." Which piece? I said. He didn't answer that. He said, it just might be cleaner to have you transition to something advisory. A consulting title. Less day-to-day visibility. I felt my pulse catch in my throat. I pressed the corner of my laptop closed slowly and looked at him. You want to demote me, I said. Not because my work is deficient. I didn't say demote. You said advisory. Advisory is a way of moving someone out of the room without walking them out the door. He picked up his phone again. I'm just raising the conversation. I said nothing for a moment. I opened my laptop again. I'll consider it, I said. I did not consider it. I began that same week to make copies. Not copies of anything secret. Everything I copied was work product I had created, analysis I had authored, models I had built, correspondence in which my role was documented. I had been meticulous about documentation since the first year, partly by instinct and partly because something in me had always understood, on a level I didn't let myself examine directly, that the day might come when I would need to prove what I had done. I began organizing it. I kept the copies on a personal drive I had maintained since before I joined the firm. I told no one. I also, in that same week, called my father. Not to tell him everything. Not yet. I called on a Tuesday evening while Garrett was at a client dinner, and I was sitting in the home office we had set up together, and that I used far more than he did. I told my father I wanted his opinion on something hypothetical. A scenario in which a senior employee at a firm had been asked to step back from their role under pressure that had nothing to do with performance. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send me the documentation and let me have our counsel look at it." I said, "It's hypothetical." He said, "Send me the documentation, Valentina." I did not send it. Not yet. But I noted that he was ready. That was the thing about my father. He was always ready before the moment required it. I had learned that from him. I was still learning how to use it. The Ellison Meridian Group annual gala was held on the second Saturday of November at the Solstice Grand in downtown Phoenix, a hotel I had helped select, a venue I had confirmed the deposit on, a guest list of 412 people I had reviewed twice for accuracy. I had organized every logistical element of this event alongside the office manager and our external event coordinator, a fact that appeared nowhere in the program, which listed Garrett as host. I wore a dress I had bought myself, deep burgundy with my hair up. I wore the earrings my mother had given me for my 30th birthday. I wore nothing Garrett had chosen. And in my small clutch, folded once along its edge, I carried the fee reconciliation summary I had printed that morning, the one with my name in the header and 19 months of numbers on the final page. I had not decided yet whether I would use it. But I had not left it at home. The evening started in the way these evenings always started. Cocktail hour in the atrium, the particular noise of 400 people performing warmth at each other, the circulating trays of things no one was really hungry for. I moved through it the way I had learned to move through Garrett's professional events. Present, composed, careful with my words, precise about whose hands I shook and in what order. Garrett was across the room when I first noticed it. Her name was Sasha Lim. She was the firm's executive assistant. She had been in that role for 11 months, hired 8 months after I joined, and she was standing beside Garrett in a way that had a specific geometry to it. Not beside him the way an assistant stands beside her employer at a professional event. Beside him in the way that communicates ownership. Her shoulder angled into his space. Her laugh timed to his. The particular quality of attention she was paying to whatever he was saying, which was not the attention of someone performing professional proximity. I had suspected. I want to say that plainly. I had not confirmed, I had not investigated, but I had known in the way that a person who pays attention to patterns cannot unknow something she has seen accumulate over months. The specific quality of Sasha's presence in the office. The calls Garrett took outside. The way he had become slightly more attentive to me in waves, the occasional dinner he proposed, the compliment that arrived slightly too deliberately, in the pattern that tends to emerge in people who are managing guilt. I watched them for a moment from across the room. Then I set down the glass I was holding, the one I hadn't been drinking from, and walked toward them. I did not walk fast. I did not walk with any visible purpose that would broadcast what I was about to do. I arrived beside them the way I had arrived at negotiating tables, calmly without announcement. "Sasha," I said. I nodded at her. Then I looked at Garrett. She turned. For 1/2 second there was something in her expression, a flicker of recalibration, and then it smoothed out into a smile. "Valentina. What a gorgeous dress." "Thank you," I said. "Would you give us a moment?" What happened next was not what I had expected, which means I had underestimated both of them. Sasha did not step back. She stepped forward, one small, deliberate step, and she put her hand on Garrett's arm and said, "Oh, I think we're fine right here. Garrett was just telling me about the Q4 restructuring. Very exciting." I felt the heat come up the back of my neck. I kept my face still. "Sasha," I said again. "Step away." She looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of a person who has calculated that they are protected. Then she said, clearly enough that the people nearest to us could hear, "You know, for someone who spent the last year barely keeping the portfolio together, you have a lot of nerve talking to people like that. Maybe focus on being a better wife before you start managing everyone else." The room around us had gone quiet in the radius of 3 tables. I turned to Garrett. I waited for him to say something. I watched his face for the moment when he would choose me. Not even choose me as a wife, choose me as a person standing in front of him who had just been publicly insulted at an event I had built. He did not choose me. What he did instead, and I want to be careful here because I have replayed this moment many times, trying to find another interpretation, and I have not found one. What he did was shift his weight slightly, press his mouth into a flat line, and then raise his right hand. He slapped me. It was open-palmed and it connected with my left cheek, and it made the kind of sound that a room of 400 people can hear when the noise has already reduced to the quiet of people who sense something happening. I did not fall. I did not make a sound. I stood exactly where I was standing, and I brought my hand up slowly and pressed my fingertips against my cheek. The room erupted in the way rooms erupt when they have witnessed something they cannot process. Not all of them laughing, I want to be precise about that, but enough of them, and some of them in the back who may not have seen and were laughing at something else, and the combined noise was indistinguishable from the sound of being laughed at in front of 400 people. I stood there for 3 seconds. I have counted them in memory many times. Then I reached into the small clutch I was carrying, took out my phone, and sent one message. Not a long one. 4 words. "Dad. It's time." I put my phone back into my clutch. I pressed my lips together once. And then I stood in the middle of that ballroom with my hands still at my cheek, and I waited. I stood in that ballroom for 6 minutes. I know it was 6 minutes because I counted the intervals between the song the band was playing. A slow, forgettable standard that continued as though nothing had happened, because the musicians hadn't seen it, or had seen it and been paid to keep playing. Around me, the evening had resumed its surface. People had turned back to their conversations, their drinks, their careful performances of not having witnessed. Sasha had moved slightly away from Garrett, not far, just enough to establish a margin of plausible distance. Garrett himself had turned toward a cluster of associates near the bar, his back to me, the line of his shoulders set in the specific posture of a man who has decided the best available move is to pretend nothing requires addressing. I did not move from where I was standing. I did not touch my cheek again. At minute 6, the ballroom doors opened. My father does not make entrances. That is one of the truest things I know about him. He has never in my memory walked into a room performing his own arrival. No announcement, no pause at the threshold, no scan of the space to confirm he has been noticed. He walked in the way he always walked. Directly, at an even pace, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have long since stopped needing to signal that they are paying attention. He was not alone. Behind him were 4 people. 3 of them I recognized. Marcus Webb, Meridian Capital's general counsel, who had been with my father for 12 years. Diana Solis, who managed LP relations for Meridian's largest institutional accounts, and a man named Clifford Park, who was the managing partner of Ellison Meridian Group's primary outside auditing firm, the firm that signed off on the annual fund statements, the firm whose continued engagement was not optional for a fund of this size and regulatory structure. The 4th person I did not know by name. He carried a soft-sided leather document case and wore a badge on a lanyard tucked into his breast pocket that I did not need to read to understand the shape of. The room did not erupt. What it did was quieter and more complete than that. A ripple of recognition moved through the space the way recognition moves through professional rooms. Not noise, but a shift in posture, a turning of heads, the specific stillness that descends when people who understand hierarchy suddenly understand that the hierarchy in the room has changed. I watched Garrett see my father. I watched the color leave his face in stages, like water draining from a glass, and I felt something settle in my chest that was not satisfaction, and was not grief, and was not the particular warm collapse of vindication. It was something simpler and harder than any of those. It was the feeling of having known what was coming and having waited long enough to let it come completely. My father crossed the room to me first. He stopped in front of me and looked at my face. He looked at my cheek. He did not say anything about it. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder once and then he removed it. And then he turned toward Garrett. Garrett had moved to intercept, the way people move when they are trying to get ahead of something they cannot actually get ahead of. He extended his hand and said, "Alejandro, I didn't know you were. This is a surprise we weren't expecting." "I know," my father said. He did not take the extended hand. He said it without particular emphasis, the way he said most things, and then he looked past Garrett toward Marcus Webb. "Marcus." Marcus Webb opened the document case and removed a set of folders, 4 of them, each tabbed, each sealed with a small label I could read from where I was standing. 1 for Garrett, 1 for Clifford Park, 1 labeled for the fund administrator, and 1 that remained in Marcus's hand. He set them on the high-top table nearest to us, the one that had been cleared of glasses sometime in the last 6 minutes by a server who was no longer nearby. "What is this?" Garrett said. He said it as a statement, not a question. "It's a notice of material interest," Marcus said. "And a request for immediate audit access under Section 14.3 of the Fund Administration Agreement. You'll recognize the clause, your outside counsel reviewed the agreement at close." Garrett looked at the folder. He did not pick it up. My father said, "Meridian Capital Partners has held a 19.4% passive interest in Ellison Meridian Group since its formation. You've known that. What changed 6 weeks ago is that the interest converted from passive to active under the terms of the original agreement, a conversion trigger your firm's counsel was notified of in writing and did not respond to." Garrett's jaw moved. That conversion was under dispute. "It was under review," my father said. "The review concluded. You were sent the outcome." He paused. Clifford Park picked up his folder. He did not open it yet. He looked at Garrett with the particular expression of a man who is about to say something he has said before and would prefer not to have to say again. "The fund audit request is procedural at this stage. The irregularities in the Q2 and Q3 fee reconciliations are a separate matter being handled through the administrator. You'll want counsel present before any of those conversations." "What irregularities?" Garrett said. "The ones Valentina documented," my father said. The room around us had gone completely still in a radius that had grown, by this point, to include most of the ballroom. 400 people had not all heard every word. But they had seen enough. They had seen my father walk in. They had seen the folders come out. They had seen the outside auditor pick up a document at an Ellison Meridian event, in front of Ellison Meridian's own employees and partners. The geometry of it required no translation. I reached into my clutch. I removed the fee reconciliation summary, folded once, my name in the header, the date clear, the calculation on the final page coming to $1.4 million. The document I had prepared 8 months ago. The one I had sent to Garrett and that he had told me was not a priority right now. I unfolded it and placed it on the table beside the other folders. I looked at Garrett. He was looking at the document. "I want to go home," I said. I said it quietly to him in the same register I used for everything. But before I do. I did not say it loudly. I said it in the voice I had used at every negotiating table, every client dinner, every meeting where I had been talked over and talked around and managed and reframed and made smaller than the work I had done. I said it the way my father had taught me to say the things that matter, without performance, without the tremor of needing the room to receive it well. You told me at a dinner with Peter Crane that I forget we're not all in the same spreadsheets. You said that after I gave the correct answer to a question you couldn't answer. What I was actually doing was reading the client's concern 2 exchanges before you did and saving the meeting. Garrett said nothing. You told me that the optics of having your wife in a senior role were getting complicated. You said some LPs had mentioned it. You never named one. What I was actually doing, during the 18 months I held that role, was recovering $940,000 in deferred fees that your previous director left on the table, rebuilding the reporting system that your outside auditors had flagged twice, and modeling the exit on the Rimmore property 6 months before the numbers forced you to agree with me. I paused. I let that land without filling the space. And you told me, not in words but in the way you introduced me at the Sedona retreat, in the way my name didn't appear in the Q3 update, in the way you suggested I step back to advisory. You told me consistently that I was here because of you, that whatever I had built inside your permission. I smoothed the edge of the document on the table with 2 fingers once. I built it inside my own competence. The documentation has my name on it. The dates are not ambiguous. I picked up my clutch. I'm not going to tell you that you made a mistake. I think you knew exactly what you were doing. I think you made a calculation and you believed it would hold. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with the heat I had felt rising in the ballroom earlier, but with the particular clarity that comes when you have finally stopped hoping the other person is someone they are not. It didn't hold. I nodded at Marcus. I nodded at Clifford Park. I looked at my father, who was watching me with an expression I had seen only a few times in my life. Not pride, exactly, something quieter and older than pride, the expression of a person who has been waiting to see whether the thing they built in someone else would hold when it needed to. I walked out of the ballroom. I did not slam the door. The ballroom doors were the heavy, pneumatically hinged kind that closed themselves slowly regardless, and they did, behind me, without sound. In the corridor outside, my mother was waiting. She had been there the whole time, I realized. She had come with my father and chosen to stay outside, which was exactly what my mother would do, and the sight of her standing there in her coat with her hands folded in front of her made my throat tighten in a way nothing inside the ballroom had. She looked at my cheek. She pressed her lips together. She opened her arms. I stood in the corridor outside the ballroom where I had organized the seating chart and confirmed the floral order and reviewed the guest list twice, and I let my mother hold me for a moment, and I did not explain anything because she already understood. The fallout was documented rather than dramatic, which is the way the most consequential things tend to unfold. The audit access request was not contested. Contesting it would have required Garrett to argue against a clause his own counsel had reviewed and signed. Clifford Park's firm completed a preliminary review within 3 weeks and referred 2 line items to the fund administrator's own compliance office. Garrett's outside counsel sent a response to Meridian's notice of active interest that my father described, in one of our phone calls, as what people write when they are stalling. The stalling did not last. Sasha Lim resigned 11 days after the gala, which I learned from Diana Solis without asking. I filed for divorce on a Thursday morning in December, 6 weeks after the gala. I have thought a great deal, in the months since, about the specific texture of being believed in without being performed for. My father never told me I was brilliant. He never told me I was special or that I was destined for something large. What he did, across my entire childhood and into my adult life, was treat my thinking as something worth taking seriously. He answered my questions with real answers. He let me sit in rooms where things were being decided. He corrected me when I was wrong without making the correction into a lesson about my worth. He gave me, without naming it, the foundational conviction that competence is not a favor you receive from someone willing to recognize it. It is a thing you build, and then you document it, and then you wait for the moment when the documentation speaks for itself. I waited longer than I should have. I know that. I stayed in something I had identified as broken because breaking it myself felt like a defeat, and I had confused endurance with integrity for long enough that they had begun to feel like the same thing. They are not the same thing. What I understand now, standing on the other side of that ballroom and that December morning and the quiet months that have followed, is that the people who truly believe in you do not need you to make yourself smaller to make them comfortable. They do not need to manage your introductions or soften your correct answers or suggest you move to advisory. A person who diminishes what you've built in order to feel larger is not a person who believes in you. He is a person who needs you to be less, and that need will never be satisfied because the problem was never the size of what you were. There is a particular kind of strength that looks like patience from the outside. It takes time to learn the difference between those two things, between waiting because you are afraid and waiting because you are ready. I spent too long in the first kind. I hope, wherever you are, that you can recognize sooner than I did which kind of waiting you're doing. If any part of this story felt close to something you've carried, share it with someone who needs to hear it. It costs nothing to pass it along, and you never know whose table it might land on. The events depicted in this story are fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is entirely coincidental. Now running packaging sections.